In the stillness of a Sicilian morning in 1910, the first cries of a child named Angelo Annaloro echo across the narrow streets of Villalba, a small hilltop village in central Sicily. The air smells of olive oil and dust, of bread baked in stone ovens, of lives bound by tradition and quiet struggle. His father, a modest grocer, dreams of something larger, a land across the sea where opportunity glimmers like the sun on the Mediterranean. For the Annaloro family, America is not a place yet, but a promise. Years later, the ship carrying them across the Atlantic slices through waves like an omen. The voyage is long, the cabins cramped, but hope is stronger than discomfort. When they arrive in the port of Philadelphia, the city feels foreign, loud, cold, and strange, yet it also feels alive. Brick row houses stand shoulder to shoulder like soldiers, the smell of coal smoke and bread fills the air, and the sound of English, mixed with a dozen other immigrant tongues, becomes the city's strange new music. The boy who will one day be called the Gentle Don watches it all in silence, learning the rhythm of a world far from Sicily. In South Philadelphia, Angelo's father opens a small grocery store, shelves lined with olive oil tins, dried pasta, and imported cheeses from the old country. The young boy spends his afternoons behind the counter, memorizing faces, learning how to weigh trust the way one weighs produce. He watches how credit is extended, how debts are collected, how favors are traded more quietly than cash. This shop, with its flickering bulbs and hum of conversation, becomes his first school in the art of human nature. The streets around the store are alive with the pulse of immigrant life, shoemakers hammering in basements, women leaning from windows to gossip, children darting between cars. But they are also rough, edged with poverty and ambition. Men whisper about opportunity, numbers rackets, protection schemes, and shipments that never pass through customs. Crime is not distant here, it is a neighbor that walks the same sidewalks, eats the same bread. Angelo listens, says little, and learns. He grows into a reserved but sharp young man, one who keeps his temper low and his thoughts private. Those who meet him describe him as polite, intelligent, even gentle, traits that mask an early awareness of power and the ways it can move unseen. In the grocery store, when disputes arise, he learns to mediate without raising his voice. When competitors cheat his father, he watches how respect can sometimes be more effective than rage. The lesson seeps in slowly, control is more frightening than fury. By the late 1920s, South Philadelphia is changing. Prohibition has turned the city into a quiet battlefield of hidden bars and backroom stills. Men in dark coats drive shiny cars at night, and the smell of bootleg whiskey lingers in alleyways. The young Angelo, now in his late teens, begins to drift beyond the grocery counter. He is seen with men who talk about easy money and faster routes to success. The quiet observer is beginning to take his first steps toward the underworld that will define him. His first brush with the law comes almost by chance, a reckless driving arrest, small by comparison to what the streets around him conceal. Yet even in that moment, the contrast between the boy from the grocery and the man he is becoming begins to emerge. He is polite with the police, careful with his words, and quick to fade back into the shadows. The lesson is clear, attention is dangerous, invisibility is power. As the decade turns, the Great Depression looms. Shops struggle, men line up for work, and hope grows thin. But in times of scarcity, the underworld thrives. People need money, and those willing to take risks can provide it, at a price. Bruno, as he will soon come to be known, begins to understand that calmness can command loyalty. He watches hot-headed men destroy themselves with greed and violence, while those who move quietly build empires that last. The transformation from Angelo Annaloro, the grocer's son, to Angelo Bruno, the future Gentle Don, is not a single act but a gradual shift, like the tide rising under a still moon. By the time the 1930s arrive, he has learned that the most powerful men are not always the loudest, nor the ones with guns in their hands. They are the ones who can listen longer than others can speak. And so, in the soft light of early evening, a young man stands outside his father's store, the glow of a cigarette tracing his outline. The sounds of the neighborhood, laughter, footsteps, the roll of streetcars, fade behind him. He looks out over the city that will one day call him Don, his expression unreadable, his ambition hidden beneath calm eyes. No one could know it then, but that quiet boy in the grocery doorway would one day rule an empire from the same streets that taught him patience. The seeds of his legend are already planted, silent, subtle, and deep. In the calm before the storm, Angelo Bruno begins his slow ascent, not with violence or boast, but with observation, restraint, and an understanding that true power often whispers before it roars. What he cannot yet see, beneath the glow of those streetlights, is the shadow of betrayal that will one day meet him at the end of his road. But for now, the night is still, the future unwritten, and the boy from Villalba walks into it, quietly, deliberately, toward destiny. The soft rhythm of life in South Philadelphia in the 1920s carries a strange harmony, the mingling of laughter, struggle, and survival. On a narrow street lined with brick homes, a small grocery shop hums with activity. Inside, young Angelo Annaloro moves with quiet purpose, stacking cans of imported tomatoes, sweeping flour from the worn wooden floor, and helping his father tally sales in a ledger that never quite balances. The store is the family's world, a place where the scent of cured meats and roasted coffee mingles with the faint tension of unpaid bills. To their customers, tired laborers, immigrant mothers, and restless boys, it is a place of comfort. To Angelo, it is something more, a classroom where human nature unfolds in small, everyday transactions. Every day, he observes how his father manages trust. When a customer cannot pay, a nod replaces a contract. When someone tries to cheat, a quiet frown carries more weight than a shout. Young Angelo watches, listens, and begins to understand that real power does not always come from force, it comes from control. In those moments behind the counter, the boy learns the essence of what would later define him, the art of getting what he wants without appearing to demand it. Outside the store, the world is shifting. Prohibition has transformed the city's underbelly into a lucrative maze of opportunity. The clinking of bottles in back alleys, the whispers about hidden breweries and speakeasies, these are the sounds of a new economy. South Philly, with its dense population of immigrants and its loyalty network stretching back to Sicily, becomes fertile ground for organized crime. Bootleggers drive through the narrow streets under cover of night, their headlights dimmed, their pockets full of money. Angelo, barely out of his teens, begins to notice the difference between his family's modest earnings and the sudden wealth of the men who move in silence and drive sleek cars. Their suits are sharper, their shoes cleaner, and yet they never seem to work a regular job. They speak softly, but everyone listens. When they enter the grocery, his father's tone shifts, respectful, measured. To Angelo, that respect is a currency more valuable than the coins that pass across the counter. He starts running small errands for neighborhood businessmen, men who operate on the edge of legality. At first, it's harmless, delivering packages, passing notes, keeping an eye on who comes and goes. But each favor brings him deeper into a web where favors are traded like gold. The young man who once counted cans now begins to count risks. The late 1920s are turbulent years. The economy wobbles, and the crash of 1929 sends waves of fear through immigrant families. Jobs vanish, banks close, and desperation thickens like smoke over the city. Yet while honest men struggle, others find ways to profit. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, and bootlegging flourish, offering quick money to those bold enough to take it. Angelo watches men double their fortunes overnight, while others lose everything. In this contrast, he finds both warning and inspiration. He is not reckless. Even in youth, Bruno is deliberate, cautious, and strategic. He avoids open confrontation, preferring to understand how the game is played before placing a bet. His first ventures are small, joining a local numbers game, investing in a friend's illicit liquor delivery route. When problems arise, he steps back rather than charge forward. Those who underestimate his quiet demeanor never realize that behind his calm eyes, he is studying every move, learning where power truly lies. One story from this time drifts through Philadelphia folklore. A local bookmaker once refused to pay a small debt owed to Angelo. Rather than retaliate with violence, Bruno reportedly went to the man's supplier, a more powerful figure, and calmly explained that trust in their circle was fragile. The bookmaker, suddenly facing pressure from above, paid immediately. The lesson became a core philosophy for Bruno's life: control people's incentives, not their fears. By 1928, his first legal trouble arrives: a reckless driving charge. It's minor, almost trivial, but it marks the first appearance of his name in police records. The report describes him as polite, cooperative, and respectful, a tone that contrasts sharply with the rougher men of the underworld. Even here, at the edge of trouble, Bruno's defining trait shines through: an instinct to stay composed, even when caught. He pays the fine, keeps his head down, and continues to rise unnoticed. At night, when the store closes and the streets quiet down, Angelo sometimes walks to the corner where the older men gather. They sit on stoops, smoking cigars, talking about opportunities. The air smells of tobacco and rain, and the conversations carry hints of ambition that go far beyond groceries. He listens more than he speaks. He learns about territory disputes, the hierarchy of respect, and the unspoken rule that loyalty, once broken, rarely mends. He also sees the toll this world takes. Friends disappear. Families whisper about sudden deaths that are never investigated. Angelo studies these patterns like a scientist examining a dangerous element. He doesn't want chaos, he wants control. And control, he realizes, requires patience and invisibility. The most successful men are those who operate quietly, who let others make noise while they make moves. During this period, Bruno begins to step out of his father's shadow. He opens small ventures, vending operations, cigarette routes, minor investments that give him independence. To the casual observer, he remains the polite grocer's son. But within certain circles, he is recognized as a man who understands discretion. He pays debts on time, never flaunts wealth, and never talks more than necessary. It is a reputation that will carry him far. As Prohibition enters its final years, the underground economy Bruno has touched begins to shift again. The end of alcohol restrictions will dry up one source of income, but others, gambling, unions, construction kickbacks, are waiting to fill the void. The city is a living organism, and crime is its circulatory system. Bruno stands at the edge of this transformation, calm and observant. One evening, as he helps his father close the store, the older man sighs and mutters about the struggle of honest work. Angelo nods quietly but says nothing. Outside, a car rolls past, a sleek black vehicle owned by one of the local racketeers. The sight lingers in Angelo's mind. He doesn't envy the violence or danger, but he sees in that car something that the grocery will never offer: autonomy. He knows he will never be a brute, never a thug who solves problems with fists or guns. But he also knows he will not spend his life measuring beans and counting pennies. Somewhere between those two worlds, between respectability and power, lies the path he will take. By the time the decade closes, the young man who once stocked shelves has begun to understand the blueprint of an empire. Money flows through relationships, respect outweighs aggression, and the man who speaks softly often commands the most attention. The grocery store remains, the shelves still lined with imported goods, but Angelo's future has already stepped beyond its door. The boy who learned the value of silence in a crowded shop is quietly becoming something else, not yet the Don he will one day be, but the foundation of one. He locks the store for the night, the bell above the door giving a faint metallic ring as it closes. The streetlights hum, the air cools, and he pauses, listening to the distant echo of a city that never truly sleeps. Somewhere in that sound is his destiny, waiting patiently for him to reach it, and he, with the calm of someone who already knows his course, begins walking toward it. The dawn of the 1930s brings a new rhythm to Philadelphia, a rhythm that beats in hidden basements and echoes through the backrooms of neighborhood bars. The Great Depression has hollowed out much of the city's industry, and men line up at soup kitchens under a gray sky that seems to never brighten. But beneath that hardship lies another current, one of opportunity. For those who can operate in shadows, prohibition has opened doors to wealth that ordinary men can't even imagine. Angelo Bruno, still in his 20s, feels that current pulling him in. He is not loud about it. His rise is invisible, like smoke weaving through cracks in a wall. While other young men chase get-rich-quick schemes with bravado and bullets, Bruno studies patterns. He sees how bootlegging routes are established, how territory disputes are quietly settled, and how a handshake can be more binding than a written contract. He begins with small favors, acting as a liaison between distributors, arranging transport, providing safe storage. His father's grocery still operates, and its modest delivery trucks provide the perfect cover for moving contraband. Olive oil crates hide bottles of gin, boxes labeled imported pasta carry whiskey from Canada. To outsiders, he is the polite shopkeeper's son helping the family business. To insiders, he is becoming a reliable, calm operator, someone who gets things done without drawing attention. At this time, Philadelphia's underworld is a patchwork of families, alliances, and grudges. Power shifts like sand in the wind. The once dominant factions from New York and Atlantic City stretch their influence southward, looking for footholds. Among those power centers stands a man whose name carries quiet authority, Carlo Gambino. He is calm, calculating, and as patient as he is ambitious. When their paths first cross in the late 1930s, a bond begins to form, one built not on friendship, but on mutual understanding. Bruno sees in Gambino a reflection of his own temperament, a man who values subtlety over spectacle, profit over chaos. Through intermediaries, Bruno begins working with contacts connected to Gambino's operations, arranging gambling lines, facilitating shipments, and smoothing tensions between Philadelphia and New York interests. It is during this period that Angelo makes a deliberate choice. He stops using the surname Annaloro and begins to introduce himself as Angelo Bruno, adopting his grandmother's maiden name. The change is symbolic, almost ritualistic. Bruno sounds cleaner, simpler, and far less Italian than Annaloro, a name easier for business, easier to hide behind. It marks the shedding of his boyhood identity and the creation of a man who intends to move among powerful figures without ever fully revealing himself. As Prohibition ends in 1933, many small-time bootleggers go broke overnight, but Bruno adapts. Where others see a closed door, he sees a new corridor opening. Alcohol may now be legal, but gambling and racketeering remain untouched. He invests in jukeboxes, vending machines, and pinball operations, machines that are technically legal but often tied to illegal betting. Each route, each coin slot, becomes part of a quiet empire. He also dips into bookmaking, the numbers game, as locals call it, a neighborhood lottery played by factory workers and shopkeepers hoping for a lucky break. Bruno's network of collectors grows, each man delivering envelopes of cash with quiet respect. The risk is real, but so are the profits. By the late 1930s, Bruno is earning far more from his under-the-table operations than from any legitimate business. Still, he keeps up appearances, maintaining his image as a modest businessman who drives an unremarkable car and dresses without flash. Every move he makes is deliberate, every relationship calculated. He never shouts, never boasts, and never lets emotion show. Even those who work for him sometimes mistake his calm for weakness, a mistake they rarely make twice. He has a gift for reading people, for understanding what drives them, what scares them, and how to use both without ever raising his voice. Philadelphia's law enforcement during these years is a mixture of corruption and incompetence. Many officers are underpaid, many others are quietly paid off. Bruno learns the rhythm of bribery, small, consistent, untraceable. He doesn't try to own the police, he simply ensures that they look the other way when necessary. His empire grows like ivy, slow, silent, inevitable. By the early 1940s, Bruno has achieved something rare, he is respected across both sides of the law. Legitimate businessmen see him as a shrewd investor. Criminal figures regard him as reliable, steady, and above all, fair. Even his enemies find it difficult to hate him, a trait that will serve him well, until it doesn't. As the decade progresses, he diversifies further. He becomes involved in construction materials, jukebox distribution, and even an aluminium products company, all fronts that provide both income and legitimacy. He learns to launder money through these ventures, turning illicit cash into clean profits. His quiet efficiency earns him new connections in New York, Chicago, and beyond. It is during this period that his relationship with Carlo Gambino solidifies. The two men share an understanding that violence, while sometimes necessary, is a tool of last resort. They meet on occasion, always discreetly, to discuss business, mutual interests, and the balance of power. Gambino, already on his own path to prominence in the New York Mafia, recognizes in Bruno a kindred spirit, a man who can rule through logic rather than fear. Their alliance, subtle and understated, becomes one of the key reasons Bruno's future reign in Philadelphia will last as long as it does. In 1945, when World War II ends and soldiers flood back into Philadelphia, the city begins to change again. Prosperity returns, and with it, opportunity. The casinos of Havana glitter, Atlantic City hums with tourists, and the American underworld begins to think internationally. Bruno follows suit, quietly investing in a hotel in Havana, an early sign that his ambitions extend far beyond his neighborhood. Even with his growing power, Bruno remains cautious. He still lives modestly, still attends mass, still walks the same streets where he grew up. The neighbors know him as a polite man who tips delivery boys well. Few suspect that the unassuming grocer's son has become one of the city's most connected racketeers. He moves through life with an almost eerie calm, never appearing hurried or worried. Those who meet him sense a presence that's hard to define, not fear, but gravity. In the twilight of the 1940s, the city's criminal landscape begins to shift once more. Old bosses fade away, replaced by men hungrier, greedier, and more violent. But Bruno's patience remains his advantage. He has built alliances across generations, earned quiet respect, and mastered the art of survival through restraint. While others draw attention, Bruno builds influence. While others reach too far too fast, he waits for his moment, knowing it will come. By the time the 1950s dawn, Angelo Bruno is no longer a mere associate. He is a man of weight, a trusted ear to powerful figures, and a bridge between Philadelphia and New York. His calm, his logic, and his unshakable patience have become his greatest weapons. He sits in his modest office late one evening, a glass of wine untouched beside him, a thin stream of smoke rising from his cigarette. The ledger before him lists names and numbers, debts and earnings, but his gaze drifts beyond it. Outside, the hum of the city feels distant, muffled. He knows the next chapter of his life is coming, one where calmness will no longer be enough, and where leadership will demand choices that no man can make without consequence. The grocery boy from Villalba is gone. In his place stands a man who has mastered the language of quiet power, the kind of man who smiles while others argue, who listens while others threaten, who always seems to know more than he says. The world will soon know his name. And when it does, they will call him something that almost sounds gentle, Don Angelo Bruno. The 1950s arrive like a tide of prosperity washing over post-war America. Cities hum with optimism, factories reopen, neon lights glow again, and the scent of fresh possibility hangs in the air. Yet beneath that golden surface, in the alleys of South Philadelphia, another world continues its quiet rhythm. It is a world of whispers, coded glances, and handshakes that carry more weight than any legal contract. In that world, a man named Angelo Bruno is beginning to rise, not through bloodshed or bravado, but through patience and persuasion. By now, Bruno has established himself as a man who can solve problems. He's not the kind of gangster who breaks down doors or issues threats. Instead, he resolves disputes the way a skilled chess player wins a match, slowly, gracefully, one measured move at a time. His reputation grows not because he is feared, but because he is trusted. In an environment where loyalty is often bought with intimidation, Bruno offers something rare: stability. South Philadelphia in the mid-1950s is an intricate web of loyalties and rivalries. The city's Italian-American neighborhoods are tight-knit but turbulent. The local Mafia family, sometimes referred to as the Philadelphia or Bruno crime family, is nominally controlled by Antonio, Mr. Mig, Polina. But Polina's leadership is old-fashioned and increasingly uncertain. The younger generation is restless. Profits are thinning. Arguments over territory and kickbacks simmer beneath polite smiles. In this atmosphere of unease, Bruno stands out for his calm. He is known to mediate rather than escalate. When two crews argue over gambling territory, he invites both sides to his office, a dimly lit backroom above a vending machine company, and listens quietly. He lets them talk themselves into exhaustion, then delivers a simple, balanced solution that leaves neither side humiliated. The men leave grudgingly satisfied, often wondering how Bruno managed to make them feel as though his decision was their own. It is during these quiet interventions that his leadership style takes form. Violence, he believes, is the refuge of the impatient. To kill a man is easy, to control him without lifting a weapon is an art. He watches other families destroy themselves through blood feuds and sees in that chaos an opportunity. If he can maintain peace, profits will grow. If he can maintain calm, power will follow. His demeanor earns him a nickname whispered first in jest, then in awe, the Gentle Don. It is meant both as compliment and curiosity. How can a man in his position survive without cruelty? How can a mafia leader command obedience with softness in his voice? Yet, Bruno proves that calm authority can be more terrifying than overt aggression. His composure becomes his armor, his restraint, his weapon. Around this time, his legitimate ventures multiply. He invests in construction materials, vending operations, and real estate, blending the legal with the illicit so seamlessly that even investigators find it hard to draw a line. He still drives modest cars, wears conservative suits, and speaks with courtesy to everyone, from city officials to low-level runners. His humility is strategic. It keeps him invisible in a world where attention is fatal. At social gatherings, Bruno rarely drinks. He sits quietly, cigarette in hand, his eyes observing everything: who laughs too loudly, who whispers too long, who avoids whose gaze. He has a gift for understanding what is left unsaid. When he does speak, his words are measured, deliberate. Associates later describe his tone as fatherly, yet beneath that softness lies precision, each phrase chosen to remind others that he knows their ambitions, their weaknesses, and their limits. In the mid-1950s, Bruno's alliance with Carlo Gambino deepens. Gambino's own rise in New York mirrors Bruno's. Both men value reason over rage, diplomacy over disorder. When the Commission, the Mafia's governing council, begins to notice instability in Philadelphia, Gambino quietly vouches for Bruno. In private meetings, Gambino praises him as steady, respectful, and profitable. Those three words carry more power than bullets ever could. Meanwhile, Bruno's relationship with law enforcement remains as carefully managed as his criminal operations. He pays small bribes but never flaunts them. He cultivates a reputation as a businessman rather than a gangster. When questioned by police, he's polite, cooperative, and vague, never hostile, never defensive. The detectives leave with nothing but the impression of a man too calm, too clean, to be the criminal they expect. It becomes a pattern that will follow him for decades: suspicion without evidence, fame without conviction. Despite his calm exterior, Bruno is not naive. He knows that the underworld runs on fear as much as respect. But he chooses his moments of force with surgical precision. When a bookmaker refuses to pay his share, Bruno doesn't send a killer, he sends a message. A single broken window, a brief conversation in a dark hallway, and the issue is resolved. The man pays. The order is restored. Bruno never has to raise his voice. His methods reflect a belief that violence, when necessary, should be quiet, efficient, and final. "Don't make a show," he reportedly told an associate. "If people see blood, they talk. If they don't see it, they forget." This philosophy earns him admiration from those who crave order and resentment from those who crave chaos. At home, his life appears almost ordinary. He dines with his wife, Sue, attends church on Sundays, and takes quiet walks through his neighborhood. Children wave to him, priests greet him warmly. The duality of his existence, family man by day, mob strategist by night, becomes part of his mystique. He is a man who can preside over a murder meeting in the afternoon and a family dinner by evening, never betraying a hint of inner conflict. As the decade nears its end, tension within the Philadelphia family grows. Paulina, feeling threatened by Bruno's rising influence, begins to plot against him. Bruno, aware of the whispers, remains outwardly serene. He knows the rules of the game: ambition breeds paranoia, and paranoia breeds mistakes. He doesn't strike first, he simply waits. Time, he believes, is the most effective weapon of all. In quiet moments, Bruno reflects on the path that has brought him here. He has climbed from the son of a grocer to one of the most respected figures in the Philadelphia underworld without a single flamboyant gesture. His empire is built on patience, his reputation on restraint. Yet he knows that such balance is fragile. Peace, in the Mafia world, is never permanent. It is borrowed time, sustained only by fear, loyalty, and luck. Late one night, he sits by his window, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. A cigarette glows between his fingers, the smoke curling upward like a prayer. He exhales slowly, watching the haze blur the outline of the skyline. In the distance, church bells mark the hour. He thinks about the years ahead, about expansion, about control, about legacy. Somewhere deep down, he senses that the path he has chosen, though calm, will eventually lead him to violence. But for now, he leans into the illusion of peace. Angelo Bruno's reputation as the gentle Don is nearly complete. He has learned how to rule men through trust instead of terror, how to build alliances instead of vendettas, and how to conceal ambition beneath the mask of modesty. The empire is forming, steady and silent. But the world around him, restless, ambitious, and impatient, is not built for peace. And so, as the 1950s fade into the 1960s, the gentle Don stands on the threshold of power, unaware that the very traits that have elevated him, calmness, mercy, restraint, will one day mark the beginning of his undoing. For in a world that thrives on fear, even gentleness can be dangerous. The year is 1959, and the winds in South Philadelphia carry a sense of unease. Beneath the surface calm of the Italian-American neighborhoods, something is shifting. Antonio, Mr. Mig, Paulina, the long-standing boss of the Philadelphia crime family, feels the weight of his own fading power. His men whisper in corners, his authority weakens, and his fear sharpens. The underworld can smell hesitation, and hesitation, in this world, is fatal. For years, Angelo Bruno has been the quiet hand behind the curtain, advising, mediating, and expanding influence without raising a finger in violence. But now, the spotlight he has always avoided begins to turn toward him. Paulina's jealousy and insecurity ignite into something dangerous, a plot to remove Bruno permanently. It begins with whispers, then meetings in smoke-filled rooms, then a plan to have him murdered. What Paulina underestimates, however, is Bruno's intuition. For a man who built his reputation on patience and subtlety, Bruno possesses an almost supernatural sense for danger. The news reaches him through a trusted associate, perhaps a word dropped too casually, or a nervous glance at a meeting. However it arrives, Bruno knows the truth: his own boss has ordered his death. Instead of reacting with rage, he reacts with precision. Bruno turns to a friend in New York, Carlo Gambino, the powerful head of the Gambino family and one of the most influential figures on the Mafia's ruling commission. The two men share mutual respect, both believers in diplomacy over bloodshed. When Bruno presents his case, Gambino listens quietly, weighing the implications. A reckless boss in Philadelphia is bad for business, and Gambino understands that stability, not chaos, keeps the money flowing. Within days, the commission calls for a private meeting. The decision is swift and decisive. Polina's leadership has become a liability. Angelo Bruno, the man once known only for his calm demeanor, is chosen as the new boss of the Philadelphia family. Polina, stripped of power, is allowed to live, a mercy that will later become a hallmark of Bruno's rule. The transition happens quietly. There are no gunfights, no public executions. Instead, one morning, the men of Philadelphia simply begin to defer to a different name. Where Polina's reign was marked by suspicion, Bruno's begins with order. The first act of the Gentle Dawn is not revenge, but reconciliation. He visits Polina, offers him safety in exchange for peace, and allows him to live out his days under quiet watch. It is a gesture that shocks the underworld. Mercy, rare as it is, becomes Bruno's most powerful signal, a warning that his rule will be built on logic, not fear. Under Bruno's leadership, the Philadelphia family transforms. Meetings that once ended in shouting now end in calm agreement. Territory disputes are settled with mathematics rather than blood. If a bookmaker owes money, Bruno calculates a fair repayment plan. If a soldier steps out of line, he is demoted, not destroyed. His approach creates an unprecedented stability that allows business to thrive. Bruno reorganizes the family's operations with surgical precision. Gambling, loan sharking, and extortion continue as always, but he discourages overt violence and keeps narcotics at a distance. Drugs bring heat, he warns. Heat brings the law. The law brings ruin. His prohibition on drug trafficking frustrates many younger associates who see fortune in heroin, but Bruno is unmoved. He believes that discipline and longevity are more valuable than fast money. The quick dollar, he tells them, is the devil's dollar. It's a philosophy that keeps him out of prison and in power for over 2 decades, a rare feat in a world where bosses often fall as quickly as they rise. His decisions are not just moral but strategic. By keeping violence low and profits steady, Bruno earns a reputation on the commission as one of the Mafia's most level-headed leaders. When disputes arise between families, he is often asked to mediate. His name carries a quiet authority, his word a sense of finality. Still, his calmness is not to be mistaken for weakness. On the rare occasions when discipline must be enforced, Bruno acts swiftly and without hesitation. A disloyal soldier might simply disappear, his car left idling at a curb, his body never found. But these acts are rare, executed only when all diplomacy fails. To Bruno, killing is not a display of strength but an admission of failure. Outside the underworld, Bruno's image remains that of a respectable businessman. He invests in real estate, vending companies, and restaurants. He shakes hands with politicians, donates to church charities, and is seen as a pillar of the Italian-American community. On Sundays, he attends Mass with his wife, Sue, and their children, sitting quietly in the pews like any other parishioner. His presence commands respect, not fear. Even his enemies, watching from afar, admit he has class. Within the family, his methods begin to shape a culture. He rewards loyalty generously, ensures that his men are well fed and their families cared for. He believes that content men are loyal men. He discourages flamboyance, no flashy cars, no loud suits, no public boasting. A man who wants to be seen, he tells them, is a man who wants to be caught. As the years pass, the family grows stronger under his leadership. The Philadelphia organization, once considered volatile and divided, becomes one of the most stable in America. The FBI notices but struggles to find a way in. Bruno rarely speaks on the phone, keeps few written records, and limits his inner circle. He trusts only a handful of men, among them Antonio Caponigro, Frank Sindun, and John Simone, lieutenants who appear loyal but will one day become the architects of his undoing. By the mid-1960s, Angelo Bruno is no longer just a regional figure. His name carries weight from New York to Chicago, whispered in the same breath as the major bosses of the commission. He is admired for his longevity, respected for his calm, and envied for his control. The gentle Don has built a dynasty not on terror, but on tact. Yet even as he perfects his craft, cracks begin to form beneath the surface. Younger members chafe under his rules. They want in on the drug trade, the fast money, the big risks. They see Bruno's restraint not as wisdom but as weakness. The old ways are fading, and the new generation is hungry. But for now, those tensions remain buried. The streets are peaceful, the profits are steady, and the Don of Philadelphia walks through his city like a quiet king. The men who once mocked his gentleness now kneel before it. The commission praises his steady hand. Even the law begins to wonder how such a calm man could command such chaos. In private moments, Bruno returns to the same thought: power earned without blood lasts longer than power taken by force. He believes this with every fiber of his being. But he cannot yet see that some men, blinded by greed, will one day take his calmness as an invitation, a fatal mistake that will end with betrayal in the dark. For now, though, Angelo Bruno sits comfortably on his throne, a ruler of shadows, a king without a crown, and a man whose gentleness has become both his greatest strength and, unknowingly, his greatest vulnerability. The 1960s dawned with a sense of transformation across America, a time of social change, cultural awakening, and rebellion against old systems. But for Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don of Philadelphia, change arrived quietly, like a tide he could guide rather than fight. The city was growing, neighborhoods were evolving, and opportunity, both legal and illegal, was everywhere. While others saw chaos, Bruno saw architecture. He didn't just want to rule a crime family, he wanted to build a structure that could endure beyond him, a machine that hummed quietly in the background of the city's daily life. Philadelphia's skyline was reaching higher, its docks busier, its working-class neighborhoods humming with industry. In this environment, the Mafia thrived best not through fear but through control, subtle, consistent, invisible. Bruno perfected this model. He didn't flood the streets with violence or drugs, he built networks, favor chains, and quiet understandings. City councilmen received donations from companies tied to his men. Contractors landed lucrative projects, as long as they kicked up their share. Judges were never bribed directly, instead, old friends introduced them to businessmen who owed Bruno favors. He structured his family like a business empire. Each crew had its own territory, its own specialization. Numbers and gambling in one district, loans and collections in another. The profits flowed upward in predictable channels, and at the top, Bruno ensured everyone had enough. The result was loyalty without constant fear. He didn't want desperate men, he wanted content ones, men who could think clearly and act reliably. It was a philosophy more in line with a corporate boardroom than the brutal mafia wars of New York. Still, the empire depended on discipline. Once a week, he held quiet meetings in his home or in the back of his vending machine office. The air would be thick with cigarette smoke, the low murmur of conversation barely above a whisper. Bruno listened, rarely interrupting. When a dispute arose, perhaps over territory or a late payment, he'd sit back, fingers interlaced, and wait until the shouting died down. Then, in his calm, gravelly voice, he'd deliver a decision that seemed inevitable, as if it had always been the only possible answer. His lieutenants left those meetings not feeling ordered but guided. Bruno also expanded the family's legitimate investments. He saw real estate as the perfect laundering tool, a business that appeared dull but was infinitely profitable. Apartment complexes, small hotels, warehouses near the docks, all found their way under companies controlled by his men. The money moved in circles, passing through clean hands before it returned to the underworld. It was an elegant system, one that kept federal investigators perpetually a step behind. Yet for all his legitimate front, the underworld remained his true kingdom. Gambling was the family's lifeblood, and under Bruno, it became an art form. From backroom poker games to large-scale numbers operations, everything was managed with care. He ensured that each operator paid fairly, that disputes were handled quietly, and that no one drew unnecessary attention. The police knew gambling existed, but under Bruno's rule, it caused no public disturbances, and so, it was tolerated. This calm extended to his relationships with other families. He maintained deep ties with New York's 5 families, particularly Carlo Gambino and the Lucchese organization. These alliances gave him protection and credibility on the national stage. When disputes arose between territories, say, over construction rackets or union control, Bruno's diplomacy often prevented wars. He had the rare ability to make both sides feel they'd won, even when they hadn't. His peers respected him for it, and in a world where ego was often a death sentence, that respect was priceless. The law, of course, was never far behind. By the mid-1960s, the FBI had begun to take organized crime seriously, launching the Top Hoodlum program and planting wiretaps across the country. In Philadelphia, agents followed Bruno's men, took photographs, compiled charts. Yet their frustration grew with every passing year. The man at the top was almost invisible, no violent outbursts, no incriminating phone calls, no flashy displays of wealth. Bruno's home was modest, his cars unremarkable. To the untrained eye, he was just another small businessman from South Philly. Occasionally, he'd be summoned for questioning. Reporters might catch a photograph of him outside a courthouse, dressed neatly in a dark suit, smiling faintly. When asked about his alleged criminal connections, he'd shrug lightly. "I'm a businessman," he'd say softly. "I sell vending machines. I take care of my family." His tone was so mild that even reporters found it hard to believe this was the boss of one of the nation's most powerful mafia families. But beneath that serenity, the machinery of his empire spun with precision. Loan sharking operations flourished, small-time borrowers, desperate for cash, paid weekly interest that seemed harmless at first but grew like vines around them. Still, Bruno insisted that collectors use discretion. "If a man owes you," he told one of his capos, "make him pay without making him bleed. A man who fears you hides. A man who respects you works to pay you back." His moral code, while self-serving, gave his organization a strange stability. Violence was bad for business, fear was expensive. The gentle Don didn't need to roar to be obeyed. A word, a nod, sometimes even a pause in conversation was enough to remind everyone who held the real power. At home, his life continued in parallel normalcy. Dinner at 6. Family on Sundays. He'd sit in his backyard on summer evenings, listening to the crickets, sipping espresso as his grandchildren played nearby. To neighbors, he was just Mr. Bruno, polite, quiet, generous. They couldn't reconcile the stories whispered in the papers with the man who helped them shovel snow or donated to church repairs. That contradiction was part of his brilliance, the ability to live as both shadow and light. By the late 1960s, Bruno's influence extended beyond Philadelphia. He quietly controlled territories in Atlantic City and had a say in rackets stretching into Delaware and South Jersey. Yet he never overreached. He believed in slow expansion, in growth that didn't draw envy or attention. His philosophy could be summed up in one phrase he often repeated: "A tree that grows too fast will break in the wind." In New York, the bosses admired his stability. The commission saw Philadelphia as a model of order: no wars, no headlines, no messy internal feuds. Bruno was invited to mediate disputes in other regions, to offer his wisdom like a statesman among criminals. It was a position of rare prestige, and he carried it with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. And yet, in the shadows of his own organization, seeds of discontent began to sprout. The younger generation of soldiers, men raised on stories of fast cash and easy power, began to murmur. They saw the heroin boom in New York, the rivers of money it brought, and wondered why Bruno forbade it. They wanted more profits, more risk, more freedom. Bruno's insistence on calm and control, once admired, now seemed to some like weakness. He didn't know it yet, but the cracks in his empire had begun to form. The silence he had built, the peace he had nurtured, would soon turn against him. For in a world ruled by ambition, no peace lasts forever, not even one built by a gentle dawn. But in the late 1960s, under the warm glow of city lights, none of that seemed real. To the world, Angelo Bruno was untouchable, the calmest man in a violent world, a boss who ruled not with blood, but with belief. His empire stretched across Philadelphia like an invisible web, delicate yet unbreakable. Or so it seemed. By the early 1970s, Angelo Bruno had become something rare in the American underworld, a mafia boss who not only survived but thrived without ever igniting a war. In an age when violence and ambition destroyed most men who rose to power, Bruno seemed to float above it all, calm and unbothered. His soft-spoken authority, once viewed as weakness, was now recognized as genius. Across the country, in the hidden corridors of the Mafia's upper hierarchy, his name was uttered with a kind of quiet respect. He was no longer just the boss of Philadelphia, he was a diplomat for the entire commission. The commission itself, the Mafia's ruling council, was a blend of old-world tradition and American enterprise. Created decades earlier to prevent the destructive gang wars that plagued the 1920s, it served as a kind of criminal congress. Each major family from New York had a seat, and powerful bosses from other regions, like Chicago, Cleveland, and Buffalo, held influence through alliances. Philadelphia, under Bruno, had long been considered a minor seat at the table. But now, thanks to his steady leadership and his deep friendship with Carlo Gambino, the city had become a crucial bridge between the major families. Bruno's relationship with Gambino was unlike most mafia alliances. Where other bosses treated meetings like battlefield negotiations, theirs were conversations between two old friends. They shared a belief that the future of organized crime lay not in chaos but in commerce. Gambino admired Bruno's subtlety, his ability to control an empire without headlines, without blood. Bruno, in turn, respected Gambino's quiet dominance of New York. Together, they formed what FBI agents would later call the Gentleman's Alliance. Their partnership was built on mutual benefit. Bruno's Philadelphia family controlled key territories along the eastern seaboard, the docks, the trucking routes, the ports that linked New York to the south. Gambino's empire extended deep into the unions and industries that kept those routes moving. By aligning their interests, the two men created an invisible corridor of influence stretching from Manhattan to Atlantic City. Money flowed freely, quietly, efficiently, and the commission approved. When disputes arose between families, it was often Bruno who stepped in as mediator. His reputation for fairness made him the perfect arbiter. He would travel to New York, sometimes under the guise of legitimate business meetings, and sit with warring bosses in back rooms of Italian restaurants or private homes. There were no raised voices, no threats. Bruno would let the others speak until tempers cooled, and then, in his measured tone, he'd offer a solution that seemed so reasonable, so balanced, that no one could object without appearing irrational. Those who attended such meetings later recalled his almost hypnotic calm. You couldn't get angry around him, one associate said years later. It was like he drained the fire out of the room. You'd walk in ready for war and leave feeling like he'd done you a favor. That talent, the power to turn potential enemies into reluctant allies, was what made Bruno invaluable to the commission. His influence extended far beyond mediation. In the 1970s, as law enforcement pressure grew nationwide, Bruno began advising other families on how to maintain low profiles. He discouraged flamboyance, the kind that had made figures like John Gotti notorious, and promoted what he called quiet money. He believed the future of organized crime was not in the streets but in the boardrooms, in the hidden layers of legitimate enterprise. He instructed his men to invest in construction, restaurants, and vending machine companies, all businesses that could launder money easily and operate under the radar. To the outside world, he appeared as a businessman expanding his portfolio. To the underworld, he was a master strategist, adapting the Mafia's old systems to a changing America. Bruno's guidance reached as far as Chicago, where bosses admired his composure. Even in Las Vegas, where casino money was flooding into Mafia hands, his name carried weight. "Bruno doesn't need to raise his voice," one Vegas associate remarked. "He just smiles, and everyone listens." But this growing influence also brought new eyes. The FBI, now equipped with more resources and federal wiretap laws, began mapping his empire in earnest. Agents called him the docile Don, mocking his calmness but secretly admiring his elusiveness. They placed listening devices in bars, restaurants, and even in the homes of suspected associates. Still, Bruno's name rarely appeared on the tapes. He almost never discussed business on the phone, and when he met in person, it was always in public, over coffee, in church basements, or during family gatherings. His discipline was maddening to investigators. When summoned to testify before grand juries, Bruno remained the picture of composure. He dressed impeccably, his silver hair combed neatly, his eyes kind but unreadable. Asked about his alleged ties to organized crime, he'd offer a faint smile. "I'm a businessman," he'd say softly. "I sell machines that play music. People enjoy music." The courtroom would chuckle, the reporters would scribble, and Bruno would quietly walk away. He was untouchable, not because he was invisible, but because he knew exactly how much to reveal, just enough to seem harmless. Still, not everyone in the underworld admired his restraint. Younger, more aggressive bosses in other cities viewed him as old-fashioned, a relic of a bygone era. They made fortunes in narcotics while Bruno continued to ban it. To them, he was leaving millions on the table. But to Bruno, drugs were the beginning of the end, a source of fast money that brought even faster ruin. "Drugs bring the heat," he told his men again and again. "And when the heat comes, everyone burns." His refusal to join the narcotics trade became both his signature and his shield. It kept federal pressure low, and it won him favor with the commission's older members, who still clung to the notion of honorable crime. Yet, beneath that moral high ground, a rift was forming within his own organization. Younger capos like Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponegro and Frank Sindun began to see Bruno's restraint as weakness. They wanted more territory, more money, more freedom. And they resented sending their profits upward while being told what not to touch. But for the moment, Bruno's rule held firm. His connections ran deep, his allies powerful, his strategies impeccable. He was invited to weddings of other bosses, to baptisms, to quiet dinners where business and friendship intertwined. His voice carried across state lines, shaping policies that affected families from Florida to New Jersey. And yet, in the stillness of his later years, he began to sense the shifting currents beneath his calm empire. The men he had mentored were growing impatient, and the world was changing faster than the old rules could contain. The Mafia itself was evolving, greedier, younger, more reckless. The quiet diplomacy that had protected him for so long was becoming a liability in an age of ambition. Still, Bruno remained steadfast. To those closest to him, he often said, "Peace is power. When everyone else is fighting, the man who waits wins." It was a philosophy he believed in until his final breath. But history, ever cruel to those who mistake silence for safety, was already setting the stage for the storm that would end the reign of the gentle Don. For now, though, in the early 1970s, he sits among giants, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, the calmest man in a violent world, his voice the quietest yet somehow the most commanding. The Commission's diplomat. The peacekeeper. The gentle Don who ruled without fear, and who would one day die because of it. By the mid-1970s, Angelo Bruno had achieved what few men in organized crime ever managed, genuine stability. His empire stretched quietly across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, a web of influence that touched everything from construction to gambling, labor unions to vending machines. For the first time in decades, Philadelphia was calm. No street wars, no bodies turning up in alleys, no sudden disappearances that drew headlines. To the outside world, it seemed that the gentle Don had truly mastered the impossible, peace in a profession built on blood. From his modest brick home on Snyder Avenue, Bruno ruled like an old-world patriarch. His house wasn't guarded by armed men or surrounded by high fences. It looked like any other home on the block. The curtains were drawn, the lawn neatly kept, the lights soft and warm. Neighbors waved to him as he left each morning, tipping his hat and offering a quiet smile. To them, he wasn't a mob boss, he was Mr. Bruno, a kind man who donated to the local church and bought candy for neighborhood children. The disarming simplicity of his public life was perhaps his greatest disguise. Inside that home, however, the machinery of a criminal empire operated with silent precision. His dining room often doubled as a boardroom. Associates would arrive discreetly, one by one, for short visits. They spoke in code, their voices low, the topics vague. The machines need restocking, might mean a collection due from a loan sharking operation. The boys are restless, could refer to tension within a crew. Bruno preferred brevity. The less said, the better. These were his golden years. His family's operations were running smoothly, profit steady, law enforcement distracted by the chaos in New York and the rise of flashier figures like John Gotti. The FBI still monitored Bruno, of course, but their frustration had turned to quiet admiration. Their wiretaps captured dozens of names and crimes, yet Bruno's voice was almost never among them. When agents tailed him, they saw a man who visited his grandchildren, attended mass, and stopped for espresso at the same corner cafe every afternoon. To his men, he was both father and philosopher. He preached patience and discipline. The man who stays quiet, he would say, dies old. His rules were simple but absolute: no drugs. No unnecessary violence. No loud mouths. And above all, no betrayal. Under these commandments, Philadelphia thrived. Bookmakers made money, collectors earned respect, and Bruno's cut flowed upward like clockwork. Everyone knew their role. But beneath that calm surface, the first hints of decay began to appear. Some of his younger captains, men who had grown up under his rule, were restless. They saw the massive fortunes being made in heroin and cocaine up north, and they wanted in. Bruno's prohibition on narcotics, once seen as wise, now seemed outdated. "The old man's holding us back," they whispered in private. "He's too soft. Too careful." Among these dissatisfied voices, one name would soon grow louder: Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponegro, Bruno's own consigliere. Bruno, ever perceptive, sensed the shift. He noticed the tone of conversations changing, the impatience in younger men's eyes, the unspoken resentment during meetings. Yet he remained composed. To him, rebellion was like weather. It came and went, and as long as the foundation was strong, the structure would endure. He reminded his closest allies that ambition could be tempered with loyalty. "If a man thinks long enough," he said once, "he'll see that peace feeds him better than war." During these years, Bruno's fortune grew in quiet, legitimate ways. His investments in real estate and vending operations brought steady returns. He owned restaurants, warehouses, and trucking companies, all small enough to avoid suspicion but profitable enough to matter. He moved money through trusted accountants, buying and selling properties under different names. To the IRS, he looked like a conservative businessman who had simply mastered the art of smart investment. Even his leisure was calculated. On weekends, he'd drive to his vacation home on the Jersey Shore, a modest bungalow near Margate. There, he'd sit on the porch with a cigar, the ocean breeze carrying the faint scent of salt and memory. Friends and associates would visit occasionally, but he preferred solitude. He'd listen to the sound of waves, reflecting on his life, the long climb from a grocer's son in Villalba to a man who commanded an empire built on silence. He understood the fragility of peace better than anyone. History had taught him that the Mafia's greatest enemy wasn't the law but ego. He had seen too many bosses fall because they couldn't resist attention, their tailored suits, their expensive cars, their public arrogance. Bruno's humility was his protection. When newspapers occasionally mentioned him as a suspected Mafia figure, he'd shake his head and smile. Suspected, he'd emphasize to friends. That's the only safe word in their vocabulary. But peace, even one so carefully maintained, always carries within it the seed of its undoing. The more Bruno's family thrived, the more his men wanted. The ban on drugs began to feel like a cage to the ambitious. Younger soldiers, eager for the kind of fast fortune their counterparts in New York enjoyed, started conducting quiet deals behind Bruno's back. They rationalized it as harmless, small transactions, limited scope. But every secret operation was an act of defiance, and defiance, in time, breeds betrayal. Meanwhile, Bruno's age was catching up with him. His once dark hair had turned silver, his steps had slowed. He still attended meetings, still commanded respect, but his energy had softened. Some mistook his calmness for weakness. Others saw his humanity, a man who had built an empire and wished only to preserve it. To his loyal inner circle, he remained a symbol of the old ways, the last of the gentleman bosses. When he spoke, they listened not out of fear but reverence. At gatherings, he'd remind them that a single violent act could undo decades of work. Blood, he'd say, is a message that never stops speaking. Still, he couldn't ignore the small fractures forming in his empire. The balance he'd perfected, that fragile harmony between greed and discipline, was starting to wobble. The same calm that once protected him was beginning to isolate him. Younger capos stopped seeking his counsel as often. Money was being skimmed. Rumors traveled faster than loyalty. And yet, outwardly, nothing had changed. Bruno's world remained serene. The city lights still glimmered on the Delaware River. His favorite cafe still brewed his espresso at precisely 3 o'clock. His family still gathered every Sunday for dinner, laughter filling the air. The Don sat at the head of the table, smiling gently, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that the peace he had built so carefully was already cracking beneath his feet. It was a peace that had lasted longer than anyone thought possible. But like all empires, it was built on trust, and trust, once shaken, never truly returns. The 1970s would close not with quiet prosperity, but with murmurs of betrayal, whispers in the dark that would one day echo in the sound of gunfire. For now, however, Philadelphia slept peacefully under the rule of its gentle Don. The city's underworld was calm, the money steady, the streets silent. It was, on the surface, perfection, the final glow of a sunset before the darkness came. By the late 1970s, the air around Angelo Bruno's empire began to change, subtly at first, like a chill creeping into a warm room. The same calm that once defined his leadership now began to suffocate those beneath him. For decades, his quiet rule had been a blessing. He had kept the peace, ensured steady profits, and avoided bloodshed. But time, as it always does, reshaped the hearts of men. What once looked like wisdom now seemed like weakness. What once was patience now felt like stagnation. Inside the Philadelphia crime family, the younger generation was growing restless. The old guard who had built their fortunes under Bruno's measured system were aging alongside him, content to maintain the status quo. But the new blood, ambitious, impatient, greedy, saw a different future. They looked north to New York and saw mountains of money flowing from the narcotics trade. They watched as other families dabbled in heroin, gambling, and unions with reckless success. And they began to ask, why not us? Bruno's ironclad ban on narcotics had always been one of his most defining rules. To him, drugs were chaos, too visible, too dangerous, too corrupting. He had seen what heroin had done to the streets of New York, how it drew attention from the FBI, and how it destroyed families. He had also seen what it did to the men who sold it, their arrogance, their paranoia, their downfall. Drugs bring heat, he would say. And heat burns everyone. But to his underbosses and street captains, those words now rang hollow. Men like Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponegro and Frank Sindan began to view Bruno as a man out of step with the times. They wanted power, more money, and the kind of influence that came with fast fortunes. They were tired of playing by rules written decades earlier by men who were now dead or dying. Caponegro in particular had grown dangerous. Cunning and ruthless, he was everything Bruno was not, impulsive, fiery, and ambitious to the point of recklessness. To many within the family, he was the natural heir, the man who could take Philadelphia into a new era. But Bruno saw something else in him, a dangerous hunger that couldn't be satisfied. He had promoted Caponegro to consigliere years earlier, hoping to channel that ambition into loyalty. Instead, he had given a wolf a seat at his table. Around this time, Bruno began hearing whispers, nothing concrete, just faint rumors carried by trusted friends. Tony's talking too much, someone would say. He's making moves. Bruno, always calm, brushed it off. Talk is wind, he replied. Let him talk. But even wind can turn into a storm if left unchecked. At commission meetings, Bruno noticed the changing tone among his peers. The old-school bosses like Carlo Gambino had passed, replaced by younger, brasher men who valued profit over tradition. When Bruno spoke of restraint, some smiled politely, others rolled their eyes. The Mafia itself was evolving, shedding its subtlety for speed, its discretion for greed. Bruno could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. Still, he clung to his principles. His focus was on stability, not expansion. He kept his business tight, his circle smaller than ever. He had survived for decades by trusting his instincts, and his instinct told him that too much change too fast led only to disaster. What he didn't realize was that the disaster was already being planned, not from the outside, but from within his own family. Caponegro's ambitions were no longer whispered in shadows. He began forming alliances, speaking in code with men from Newark and New York. He complained that Bruno was choking the family's potential, that he refused to adapt to modern times. He hinted that the commission itself was ready for new blood, that perhaps even they were tired of Bruno's old-fashioned ways. These small conversations, shared over wine and cigars, began to evolve into something darker, a plot, quiet but deliberate. Caponegro convinced himself that the commission would bless a change in leadership, that Bruno's era had ended. He claimed to have permission, though whether that permission was real or fabricated remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Mafia world. Meanwhile, Bruno continued his daily routines, unaware of just how deep the cracks in his kingdom had grown. He spent his mornings reading the paper, his afternoons at his café, his evenings surrounded by family. His calm demeanor made it impossible for his enemies to know whether he suspected anything. If he did, he showed no fear. Perhaps he believed his peacekeeping record would protect him. Perhaps he thought that the men he had raised would never dare lift a hand against him. But the signs were there. Some associates stopped calling as often. Others avoided his presence altogether. Bruno's most trusted allies began noticing strange behavior, unexplained meetings, evasive answers, new alliances forming out of sight. The tension was invisible to outsiders, but to those within the family, it was suffocating. Even his closest confidants could feel it, a quiet, creeping paranoia that settled over every meeting. Eyes darted to the door. Conversations were shorter. No one wanted to be the one caught on the wrong side when the inevitable shift came. The very calmness that once protected Bruno now became his blindfold, hiding the betrayal that was closing in. In those final months of the 1970s, Philadelphia's underworld existed in a strange twilight, still outwardly peaceful, but heavy with unspoken conflict. Money flowed, businesses ran, but every handshake carried suspicion. The air was thick with secrets. And yet, Bruno remained composed. When asked about the tension in his organization, he smiled faintly. Families fight, he said softly. It's what they do. But blood brings nothing but bad luck. To those around him, he seemed unshakable. But behind his calm exterior, even he could feel the chill of betrayal creeping closer. He began holding fewer meetings, retreating further into privacy. Some say he started to isolate himself, not out of fear but out of fatigue, a man tired of holding together a family that no longer respected his vision. He was nearing 80, still sharp but weary, surrounded by men who had forgotten the lessons that once kept them safe. The cracks in Bruno's kingdom were no longer cracks, they were fractures. His authority was being tested openly, his word no longer law. To his loyalists, it was heartbreaking. To his enemies, it was opportunity. The city that had once bowed to him now waited for change, hungry and impatient. And somewhere in that growing silence, betrayal was taking root. A betrayal that would not only end Bruno's reign but would mark the death of the old Mafia, the quiet, disciplined, rule-bound underworld he had spent his life protecting. As the decade came to a close, the gentle Don's world, once so serene, stood on the edge of collapse. He didn't know it yet, but the men who would destroy him were already smiling in his company, shaking his hand, calling him boss. And in the shadows of Philadelphia, the storm he had spent 40 years avoiding was finally beginning to form. By the dawn of 1980, the Philadelphia Mafia seemed, at least on the surface, as stable as it had ever been. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, remained the undisputed head of the family, the arbiter of peace, the calm voice that had kept the city's underworld from tearing itself apart for 2 decades. But beneath that serene exterior, betrayal was taking shape, a quiet, patient betrayal orchestrated not by rivals from other cities, but by the very men who had once sworn loyalty to him. It began with whispers, the kind that float around card tables and dimly lit bars, half-truths passed off as certainty. Tony "Bananas" Caponigro, Bruno's own consigliere, had grown bold. For years he had lived in Bruno's shadow, bound by the Don's strict rules and moral restraint. Caponigro craved more money, more respect, more freedom to rule as he saw fit. And as his ambition deepened, his patience thinned. Caponigro began to convince himself that Bruno was holding back the entire family. "We're sitting on gold," he would say in private, his voice bitter. And the old man's too afraid to dig. He started meeting with key lieutenants behind closed doors, Frank Sindun, John Simone, and others who felt stifled under Bruno's leadership. Over quiet dinners and whispered phone calls, a dangerous alliance began to form. The plan was simple in theory but deadly in execution: remove Bruno and replace him with Caponigro as boss. It was not the first time a mafia underboss had dreamed of taking power, but it was among the riskiest, because killing a sitting boss without the commission's approval was considered a death sentence in itself. The commission, composed of the most powerful mafia leaders in America, was meant to prevent internal wars. To assassinate a boss without permission was to defy the very heart of La Cosa Nostra. But Caponigro was cunning. He told his co-conspirators that he had received the commission's blessing, that the New York families, tired of Bruno's cautious ways, had quietly approved his removal. Whether this was true or a desperate fabrication remains one of the Mafia's great mysteries. Some believe Caponigro was manipulated by outsiders, perhaps by a New York boss who wanted Philadelphia destabilized. Others say he simply lied to convince his men that the coup would be sanctioned. Either way, the lie worked. The plan moved forward. Frank Sindun, a sharp but ruthless bookmaker, agreed to back Caponigro. John Simone, who controlled parts of Newark, offered additional support. Together, they began gathering intelligence on Bruno's movements, habits, and security, or rather, the lack of it. The irony was painful: Bruno's lifelong belief in peace, his aversion to bodyguards and armored cars, now made him the easiest target in the underworld. In early March of 1980, Caponigro and Sindun met privately in a Newark apartment. There, they finalized the plan. Bruno would be killed quickly, cleanly, with no public spectacle. The message would be that change had come, that the old world had ended and the new one was ready to begin. Yet, even as they plotted, doubts lingered. Caponegro's conscience was not entirely silent. He had known Bruno for years, had eaten at his table, sought his advice, and called him boss. But greed has a way of dulling guilt. Each time hesitation rose in his chest, he reminded himself that the commission had sanctioned the act. "It's business," he would mutter. "Just business." Meanwhile, Bruno remained completely unaware of how close danger had come. He continued his routines with the same quiet dignity, attending meetings, checking on his businesses, visiting family. He had lived too long in peace to suspect war. Even if he sensed unease, he likely thought it would resolve itself, as it always had, through patience and diplomacy. He did not know that his most trusted advisor had already signed his death warrant. In those weeks before his murder, Bruno's behavior seemed almost prophetic. He spent more time with his family, more hours sitting on his porch smoking cigars. He spoke to his children about changing times, about the need to stay away from the family business. To his closest confidant, he confided, "Things are different now. Men don't have respect anymore. They don't listen." Perhaps he sensed the growing disloyalty, but not its full measure. Perhaps he believed he still had time to fix it. As the plot deepened, the logistics were quietly set in motion. Bruno's driver and bodyguard, John Stanfa, a loyal but cautious man, would unknowingly become part of the trap. On the night of March 21, 1980, Bruno was scheduled to meet with Caponegro. The meeting was presented as routine, a discussion about territory and business disputes in Newark. Bruno, always punctual and trusting, agreed. That night, Bruno left his home wearing his usual soft gray suit and overcoat, carrying no weapon. He entered his car, a simple, unassuming sedan, and sat in the passenger seat. Stanfa took the wheel. They drove through the quiet streets of South Philadelphia, the spring air cool and still. The city seemed asleep. Somewhere along the route, another car followed. Inside were men loyal to Caponegro, men who had sworn the oath of silence but were now preparing to break every sacred rule of that life. The betrayal was complete. The gentle Don, who had built his empire on trust and restraint, was being driven straight into an ambush designed by the very man he had once trusted most. Caponegro waited for confirmation. He wanted the act to be clean, quick, efficient, no mess. He believed that by the next morning, the commission would recognize his leadership, that Philadelphia would fall in line, that the old world of peace would finally give way to the new world of profit. But in the shadows of that cold March night, the plan carried an invisible curse. The moment the first shot would ring out, a chain of events would begin that none of them could control, a chain that would destroy them all. For now, though, the city slept, unaware of the betrayal about to unfold. Bruno's car moved slowly through the streets he had ruled for decades. The man who had outlasted wars, prosecutors, and rivals was on his final ride, calm, unguarded, and trusting to the very end. As they neared his home, Bruno looked out the window, the faint glow of streetlights washing over his face. He might have been thinking of his next meal, or his next meeting, or perhaps nothing at all. The night was quiet, the city at peace, the kind of peace he had always cherished. And yet, somewhere behind that peace, the gun was already waiting, the betrayal already set in motion. The man who had ruled with gentleness was about to learn the cruelest truth of all, that in the world he helped build, even peace can become a weapon. The car rolled to a stop, the engine idling softly. A moment later, the silence of South Philadelphia would shatter, and with it, the reign of the gentle dawn. The night of March 21, 1980, was cool and still, the kind of early spring evening when South Philadelphia seemed to exhale after a long winter. The streets were quiet, the air faintly carrying the smell of roasted peppers and bread from family kitchens. To most, it was an ordinary Friday night. But for one man, the most powerful figure in the city's underworld, it would be his last. Angelo Bruno had spent his final day in much the same way he had spent countless others, calmly, routinely, without any hint of paranoia. He had breakfast with his wife, made a few phone calls, and met discreetly with a handful of associates. There was nothing unusual, nothing that suggested he was in danger. Even after decades in the Mafia, he remained unarmed, unafraid, confident in the peace he had built. That evening, shortly after 9 p.m., Bruno's driver and trusted aide, John Stanfa, arrived at his home on Snyder Avenue. The street was dimly lit, the sounds of laughter echoing faintly from nearby row houses. Stanfa parked the car, a simple brown Chevrolet, in front of the house. Bruno stepped outside, his overcoat draped neatly over his shoulders, his hat tilted slightly, an old-fashioned touch he never abandoned. He moved slowly but with the calm assurance of a man who believed the city was still his. He slid into the front passenger seat, the car door closing softly behind him. Stanfa started the engine. Their destination, as far as Bruno knew, was a short drive away, a quiet meeting about territory issues in Newark. Nothing serious. Nothing dangerous. The car rolled through the narrow streets, the hum of the engine blending with the distant city noise. But somewhere in the darkness, the trap was already set. A second vehicle, carrying the gunmen and lookouts, was positioned along Bruno's route home. The exact planning of the ambush remains shrouded in mystery, but what is certain is that the betrayal came from within, men who knew his every routine, who understood that he never traveled with bodyguards or suspicion. Around 10:30 p.m., as the car idled outside Bruno's home again, some accounts say he had just returned from his meeting, others that the car had merely paused before leaving. A dark figure approached from the shadows. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint rumble of the engine. Without warning, a shotgun blast tore through the passenger window. The explosion of sound shattered the calm night. Bruno's head snapped forward, and he slumped instantly against the dashboard, his hat sliding off his knee. The single blast had struck him at close range, killing him instantly. The gentle Don, the man who had spent a lifetime avoiding violence, had been murdered in the quietest of moments. Stanfa, miraculously unharmed, froze in shock. He didn't move, didn't scream. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the lifeless figure beside him, his boss and mentor. Then, acting with the calm of a man trained for survival, he slipped out of the car and vanished into the night, leaving the scene before police could arrive. When the authorities discovered the body shortly after, they were stunned. The man who had eluded them for decades, the untouchable, had finally been silenced, not by law, but by his own world. Bruno's body sat slumped in the passenger seat, his head leaning slightly to one side, his hands resting quietly in his lap. His face, despite the fatal wound, appeared strangely peaceful, as though he had fallen asleep mid-thought. The image was haunting, a symbol of everything Bruno represented. The Don who had ruled without fear, who had avoided bloodshed, had met his end in the same calm silence he had always preached. Newspapers would later describe it as an execution of chilling simplicity. There were no chases, no shootouts, no spectacle, just one blast, one man, and the end of an era. Word of the killing spread quickly through Philadelphia. By dawn, the underworld was buzzing. Soldiers and captains made frantic phone calls, trying to confirm the impossible. "They got him," one voice whispered in disbelief. "Bruno? Impossible." But it was true. The gentle Don was gone. For law enforcement, the assassination was both a shock and an opportunity. FBI agents and police detectives flooded the scene, cameras flashing in the cold morning light. They examined the car, the shattered glass, the blood-stained upholstery. Reporters gathered behind yellow tape, scribbling notes, capturing photographs that would appear on front pages across the country. One photo, in particular, would become infamous, a close-up of Bruno's lifeless body slumped in the passenger seat, his hat still resting on his knee, untouched by the blast. It was a grim portrait of betrayal, a snapshot that seemed to whisper the cruel irony of his life, that even the most peaceful of dons could not escape the violence of the world he had chosen. The FBI quickly suspected that the hit had come from within Bruno's own organization. There were no signs of struggle, no robbery, no motive from rival cities. This was an inside job, carefully planned, perfectly executed, brutally final. Agents began compiling lists of known associates, focusing immediately on Caponigro and Sindun, men whose ambitions had been noted in wiretap reports. Meanwhile, the streets of South Philadelphia fell into uneasy silence. For years, the neighborhood had been Bruno's domain, a place where people felt safe under his rule, where disputes were settled quietly, where business ran smoothly. Now, fear crept into every corner. If they could kill him, one bookmaker muttered, nobody's safe. Funeral arrangements were made with quiet dignity. Despite his criminal legacy, hundreds attended to pay their respects. The procession moved slowly through the city, a sea of black coats and bowed heads. Police watched from a distance, their presence heavy but restrained. For many who had known Bruno personally, it was not just the funeral of a man, it was the funeral of an era. Among the mourners, there was unease. The men who had plotted his death did not attend, of course, but their presence was felt in every suspicious glance, every hushed conversation. Everyone knew that Bruno's assassination would not end in peace. In the Mafia, murder never closes a chapter, it only opens another. As his coffin was lowered into the ground, the skies above Philadelphia hung gray and still. Somewhere, far from the cemetery, his killers toasted quietly, convinced that their new reign had begun. But history has a dark sense of irony. Within weeks, their victory would curdle into terror, and their betrayal would bring down a wrath greater than anything they had imagined. For now, though, the city mourned. The gentle Don who had ruled with patience and dignity lay buried, his empire already fracturing without him. The man who believed that peace was power had been silenced by the very greed he spent his life restraining. In the end, there were no last words, no warnings, no pleas for mercy, only silence. The same silence that had been his weapon now became his epitaph. And as night fell again over South Philadelphia, the streets that once whispered his name seemed to mourn quietly, the calm before the chaos that was yet to come. The days following Angelo Bruno's assassination unfolded like a slow-moving nightmare for the Philadelphia underworld. The calm, orderly structure he had maintained for 2 decades began to crumble almost instantly. What had once been a kingdom of quiet diplomacy was now infected with paranoia, greed, and retribution. For years, Bruno's peaceful reign had kept tempers cool and ambitions contained, but his death cracked open the foundation. The very men who had toasted his murder would soon realize that they had unleashed something they could no longer control. The city itself seemed to reflect the chaos. South Philadelphia, with its brick rowhouses and narrow alleys, had always carried the scent of simmering danger beneath its calm exterior, but after the hit, that danger surfaced. Longtime associates looked over their shoulders, wives whispered nervously over dinner tables, and the FBI, sensing opportunity, circled like vultures. Agents began tapping phones, tailing suspects, and quietly interviewing informants who suddenly seemed more talkative than ever. Everyone knew that the gentle Don had been replaced by something far more volatile. At the center of the brewing storm stood Antonio Caponigro, Tony Bananas, the very man suspected of orchestrating Bruno's demise. He had convinced himself that with Bruno gone, the commission would approve his leadership. After all, he was a seasoned figure, ambitious, connected, and ruthless when necessary. To Caponigro, Bruno's pacifism was weakness. The Philadelphia family, he believed, needed a harder edge, someone willing to expand territory, shake down unions, and stand up to New York. In the first few days after the assassination, Caponigro began moving quietly to consolidate power. He reached out to lieutenants in Newark and South Philly, offering assurances that stability would return. "It's business," he reportedly said to one associate. The old man was slowing things down. "Now we move forward." But what Caponigro didn't know, what no one had told him, was that his act of ambition had already sealed his fate. The Mafia Commission, headquartered in New York, was livid. In the rigid hierarchy of La Cosa Nostra, the murder of a boss required explicit approval from the commission. It was a rule born of respect and control, ensuring that no family's internal war would threaten the delicate balance of power among the 5 families. By killing Bruno without authorization, Caponigro had broken one of the oldest laws of the Mafia world. Within days, whispers spread that the commission had convened an emergency meeting. Representatives from New York, Chicago, and other major cities attended. Their verdict was unanimous: Bruno's murder was unsanctioned. The order was clear: the man responsible had to pay with his life. But Caponigro didn't yet realize that he was walking into a trap. When he received word that the commission wanted to meet with him, he saw it as validation, a formal acknowledgement of his leadership. He even bragged to close associates that New York would crown him the new boss. In his mind, the future was his. Meanwhile, Philadelphia's underworld continued to splinter. Caponigro's supposed allies, like Frank Sindun and John Simone, were privately panicking. They had supported the hit, expecting profit and power. But as the commission's anger became clear, their confidence vanished. They began to suspect that the axe would fall on them next. Meetings that had once been filled with laughter and brandy now dissolved into silence and suspicion. Everyone knew that the Mafia's code was merciless: one wrong move, and your own allies could be the ones tying your hands. The FBI, watching from the outside, saw the tension unfold but didn't yet know the full extent of what was coming. What they did know was that the Bruno family was eating itself alive. Agents noted the sudden disappearances of lower-ranking members, the quiet funerals, the empty houses. "They're cleaning house," one agent remarked grimly. By early April, just weeks after Bruno's funeral, Caponigro and Sindun made their way to New York for the commission meeting. The car ride up the turnpike was long and tense. According to later testimony, Caponigro carried with him a suitcase filled with cash, a peace offering, he thought, to the bosses who would anoint him. As they entered the city, the skyline glowed with promise. He likely believed that this was the beginning of a new era for Philadelphia. He couldn't have been more wrong. The meeting, according to Mafia lore, was brief and final. Caponigro was accused directly of ordering Bruno's death without permission. His protests, that he had been misled, that others had approved it, fell on deaf ears. There was no debate, no vote. The decision had already been made before he walked in the door. The commission had decided that both he and his co-conspirators would pay the ultimate price. A few days later, in April 1980, the body of Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponigro was found stuffed into the trunk of a car in the Bronx. His corpse bore signs of torture: beaten, stabbed, and wrapped in plastic. In his mouth was a collection of dollar bills, a symbolic message from the commission: his greed had killed him. The same week, his ally Frank Sindun was found dead in a parking lot in South Philadelphia, shot multiple times. John Simone, another conspirator, disappeared shortly after. His remains were never definitively found. The message was unmistakable: order had been restored. The betrayal of Angelo Bruno had been avenged, and the Mafia's code had been upheld. No one, no matter how powerful or ambitious, could defy the hierarchy without consequence. In the following months, a strange silence settled over Philadelphia. The old guard had been decimated, and no clear successor emerged. The family that had once been united under Bruno's steady hand now drifted in confusion. Meetings were sporadic, loyalties uncertain, and trust almost non-existent. The Bruno family, once one of the most stable and profitable on the East Coast, had become a cautionary tale of betrayal and blood. Yet, beneath the surface, new figures began to rise: younger, hungrier men who saw opportunity in the chaos. Among them was Nicodemo "Little Nicky" Scarfo, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with terror. Where Bruno had been calm and diplomatic, Scarfo was ruthless and unpredictable. And as the dust settled from the bloodbath of 1980, Philadelphia's underworld braced itself for a reign of violence unlike anything it had seen before. In the space of just a few months, everything Bruno had built, his peace, his balance, his quiet dominance, had been destroyed. The men who killed him had met their ends in pain and humiliation. The family he had nurtured now stood fractured, leaderless, and afraid. The gentle Don had believed that trust and respect could rule over fear. But in the aftermath of his death, fear became the only law left standing. The streets that had once whispered his name in reverence now spoke it in mourning, as if the city itself understood that with Bruno's death, something larger had died too, the last breath of decency in a world built on deceit. And in the stillness of those uneasy nights, the lesson of his downfall lingered like smoke, that in the Mafia, even the gentlest hand can be crushed by the weight of betrayal. In the power vacuum that followed Angelo Bruno's murder and the swift executions of his conspirators, the Philadelphia crime family descended into chaos. For the first time in decades, there was no guiding hand, no clear successor, and no peace. The empire Bruno had built through patience and diplomacy had collapsed into mistrust and fragmentation. Capo regimes operated like small warlords, carving up territories and demanding tribute. The once disciplined hierarchy became a collection of splintered loyalties and restless ambition. Amid this confusion, one name began to surface repeatedly, a man whose reputation was both feared and whispered, Nicodemo Scarfo, known on the streets as Little Nicky. To the casual, Scarfo was an unlikely candidate for leadership. Barely 5'5", with sharp features and a temper that could ignite like gasoline, he had spent years in near exile, living in the quiet resort town of Atlantic City after being banished by Bruno himself for excessive violence. Yet in the wake of Bruno's death, Scarfo's ruthless nature, once a liability, became his greatest asset. Scarfo had long believed that Bruno's gentleness was weakness. In his mind, power came not through patience, but through fear. As the city's underworld fractured, Scarfo saw opportunity in the ruins. From his small office in an Atlantic City construction company, a front for mob operations, he began quietly consolidating influence. The legalization of casino gambling in Atlantic City in the late 1970s had created a gold rush of money, contracts, and corruption, and Scarfo positioned himself perfectly to exploit it. He started by aligning with key figures who had survived the post-Bruno purges. One was Philip, Crazy Phil, Leonetti, his nephew, who became his right-hand man and enforcer. Leonetti was young, sharp, and utterly loyal, traits that made him invaluable in a world where betrayal had become commonplace. Together, the uncle-nephew duo began weaving a network of loyalty that extended from Atlantic City's boardwalks to South Philadelphia's back alleys. Scarfo's early moves were cautious, almost methodical. He kept his profile low, allowing others to destroy one another in the scramble for control. When arguments broke out between rival factions, Scarfo offered to mediate, not out of goodwill, but to gather information and weaken both sides. He understood that patience could serve his bloodlust, he would wait until the perfect moment to strike. By 1981, that moment arrived. With most of the old guard dead or in hiding, the commission needed someone to restore order in Philadelphia. They were hesitant to choose Scarfo, his reputation for violence was notorious, but they also saw no better option. Scarfo had proven loyal to New York during the Bruno fallout and had successfully maintained peace in his own operations. Thus, with quiet approval from the higher powers, Little Nicky Scarfo was named boss of the Philadelphia crime family. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a small coronation in the shadows. But for those within the underworld, it was the beginning of a new and terrifying era. Scarfo ruled not with Bruno's calm hand but with iron and blood. His philosophy was simple: fear keeps them loyal. From the moment he took control, Scarfo set out to reassert dominance through violence. Every perceived slight, every question of authority, was met with swift and brutal retribution. He reorganized the family with military precision, demanding absolute obedience. Meetings that once felt like polite discussions under Bruno now resembled interrogations. Associates arrived early, spoke little, and avoided eye contact. Even the most seasoned mobsters felt the tension. Scarfo's paranoia was legendary. He trusted almost no one, not even his closest men. Wiretaps later revealed his habit of speaking in riddles, using coded language for even mundane topics. He believed that every wall could have ears, every friend could turn informant. Yet for all his suspicion, his command was absolute. Those who crossed him simply vanished. Under Scarfo, Atlantic City became the family's crown jewel. He demanded a cut of every construction deal, every casino contract, every skimmed dollar. Legitimate businessmen were forced to pay tribute or face ruin. The city's boom meant endless cash flow, and endless temptation for greed. His soldiers, emboldened by the sudden wealth, became more reckless, flaunting their power in ways that would have horrified Bruno. But Scarfo didn't just want money, he wanted respect, and more importantly, fear. In his mind, fear was the only way to guarantee loyalty. He reinstated old Mafia rituals, enforcing omerta, the code of silence, with lethal precision. One associate who casually mentioned Scarfo's name in public was found days later in the trunk of his car, his throat cut. The message was unmistakable: the new boss tolerated no mistakes. For the older generation of mobsters who had served under Bruno, the change was jarring. The days of diplomacy were gone. Bruno had built bridges, Scarfo burned them. He saw compromise as weakness, kindness as stupidity. Where Bruno would have sought negotiation, Scarfo demanded blood. His rule turned Philadelphia from one of the most peaceful Mafia territories into one of the most violent in America. Yet, despite his cruelty, Scarfo was undeniably effective, at least for a while. The family's revenue skyrocketed. Atlantic City's casinos provided millions in steady income, and his extortion operations expanded into unions, construction firms, and loan sharking rings. His control extended like a spider's web across the East Coast. Even his enemies had to admit that he had revived the family's financial power. Still, the cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The very fear that had secured his rule was also isolating him. Associates whispered behind closed doors. Some began cooperating quietly with federal investigators, driven not by conscience but by terror. The FBI, emboldened by new surveillance technology, began tightening its grip on the Philadelphia family, recording conversations that would one day bring the entire house of cards crashing down. For now, though, Scarfo sat at the peak of his power. The man once exiled for his temper had become the king of Philadelphia. But it was a throne built on corpses, a kingdom trembling beneath the weight of its own brutality. The ghost of Angelo Bruno seemed to linger in every shadow, a silent reminder of what the family had lost, a gentler kind of order, a peace that would never return. As Scarfo looked out over his empire, the neon lights of Atlantic City flickering against the dark ocean beyond, he must have believed he had achieved what Bruno never dared attempt: complete control through fear. But in the world of organized crime, fear is a fire that consumes everything it touches. And soon, even little Nicky would learn that the same flame that builds power can just as easily turn to ash. By the early 1980s, Philadelphia's criminal landscape had been reshaped into something unrecognizable. The calm precision of Angelo Bruno's era had vanished, replaced by the thunderous chaos of little Nicky Scarfo's rule. What had once been a disciplined organization governed by quiet diplomacy had become a regime of terror, a city held hostage by paranoia, greed, and violence. Scarfo didn't just inherit Bruno's empire, he transformed it into a war machine fueled by intimidation. Every whisper, every handshake, every glance on the streets of South Philadelphia carried the same question: who would be next? Scarfo ruled from his base in Atlantic City, but his reach extended deep into Philadelphia's heart. His small stature contrasted sharply with his explosive temper. Those who met him often described an eerie duality: a man capable of speaking softly one moment, then erupting into murderous rage the next. Associates quickly learned that even a misplaced word could mean death. One soldier, a loyal earner who made the mistake of joking about Scarfo's height, was found days later beaten and shot in an abandoned lot. The message traveled fast: humor had no place in Scarfo's world. Unlike Bruno, who relied on consensus and subtle influence, Scarfo demanded absolute control. He viewed dissent as treason, suspicion as guilt, and respect as something to be extracted through fear. His word was law, and that law was enforced through a campaign of relentless violence. In less than a decade, dozens of murders would be traced directly to his orders. Every one of them served a purpose: to remind the family that loyalty was survival, and disobedience was death. But Scarfo's paranoia extended beyond his enemies. He mistrusted everyone, even his own blood. His nephew and underboss, Philip "Crazy Phil" Leonetti, became both his most valuable ally and his most dangerous witness. Scarfo's relationship with Leonetti was complex, built on loyalty, fear, and the unspoken understanding that betrayal would mean annihilation. Together, they ran the organization like a pair of coiled snakes, striking with precision at any hint of defiance. Scarfo's rule coincided with a new era of opportunity, and danger, in the Mafia world. The rise of Atlantic City's casino industry in the late 1970s had opened a financial goldmine for organized crime. Unions, contractors, and city officials all sought their share of the boom. Scarfo inserted himself into every deal, demanding kickbacks and control over construction projects. No contract was too small, no profit too insignificant. He even extorted legitimate businessmen who had no connection to organized crime, forcing them to pay tribute simply to operate in peace. But greed has a way of drawing attention, and Scarfo's empire began to attract the scrutiny of federal authorities. The FBI, having spent years quietly observing, now had a clear target. Under Bruno, surveillance had yielded little. Bruno's calm demeanor and minimal communication left investigators with scraps. Scarfo, on the other hand, left trails of bodies and terror. The Bureau ramped up its wiretaps, bugged meeting spots, and turned small-time associates into informants. Still, for several years, Scarfo seemed untouchable. His combination of ruthlessness and cunning kept him one step ahead of both law enforcement and rivals. He manipulated city officials, used his lawyer contacts to stall investigations, and ensured that witnesses were too frightened to talk. On the streets, his soldiers operated like a military unit, disciplined, brutal, and unquestioning. Scarfo demanded daily reports on everyone's earnings and whereabouts. He would often call random members in the middle of the night to test their loyalty. "Where are you?" he'd ask. The wrong answer could lead to a grave. As his empire expanded, so did his cruelty. He ordered hits not only for disobedience but also for perceived slights. A union official who refused to pay tribute was executed in broad daylight. A low-level associate suspected of talking to the FBI was found stuffed in a trunk. Even family gatherings became dangerous. Scarfo once berated a cousin for failing to greet him properly, then later had the man's business seized. Fear became the currency of the city. Bartenders, bookmakers, and union bosses all spoke Scarfo's name in hushed tones. "He's everywhere," one local said. "You don't see him, but he sees you." Under Bruno, people had respected the Mafia as a quiet power that maintained order. Under Scarfo, they dreaded it. The streets that had once been safe under Bruno's "no bloodshed" policy now echoed with gunfire and whispers of revenge. The irony was unmistakable. Scarfo believed he was restoring discipline through fear, but in truth, he was destroying the very structure that had once protected the family. By ruling through terror, he ensured that no one truly trusted him. Even his closest lieutenants began keeping mental lists of grievances, waiting for the day his grip might weaken. Scarfo, however, was blind to this. He saw himself as the ultimate boss, untouchable. Immortal, a god among men. His vanity grew alongside his paranoia. He began wearing tailored suits modeled after Al Capone's style and demanded that associates kiss his hand in greeting. He dined in private rooms guarded by armed men and insisted that no one sit higher than him at the table. "Power is respect," he often said. But what he called respect was, in truth, terror disguised as loyalty. In 1985, Scarfo's influence reached its zenith. His control over Atlantic City's unions was near total, and his operations extended into loan sharking, drug trafficking, and gambling. The money flowed, and with it came a sense of invincibility. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of his success, cracks were forming. His enemies were multiplying, both within and outside the family. Old-timers who had survived Bruno's reign despised Scarfo's brutality, while younger associates, eager for quick profits, began questioning his leadership. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation tightened like a noose. Agents had succeeded in turning several of Scarfo's lower-level associates. Among them was a soldier named Tommy Dell, whose quiet cooperation gave federal prosecutors a window into Scarfo's operations. For the first time, investigators could map the entire hierarchy of the Philadelphia mob, from street-level bookmakers to Scarfo himself. Scarfo's empire was vast, but it was also brittle. The constant killings, betrayals, and fear had made it impossible to maintain long-term stability. While Bruno had built his power on diplomacy and alliances, Scarfo had built his on intimidation, and intimidation is a poor foundation when the walls begin to shake. As 1986 dawned, Little Nicky sat atop his empire, believing himself untouchable. But history was already turning against him. The commission trials in New York had weakened Mafia power nationwide. Federal laws had become sharper, penalties harsher, and wiretap evidence nearly impossible to refute. The same paranoia that had once protected Scarfo now began to consume him entirely. The story of Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, still lingered in the minds of older members. They spoke of his calm, his respect, his control. Bruno ran this city with a whisper, one said. Scarfo runs it with screams. And though the new boss couldn't see it yet, the echoes of those screams were growing louder, bouncing off courtroom walls, FBI offices, and the darkened streets where his soldiers once walked with pride. Scarfo had inherited a throne soaked in betrayal. But by turning that throne into an altar of fear, he had unknowingly set in motion his own downfall, and with it, the final destruction of the Philadelphia family that Angelo Bruno had once ruled with quiet grace. By 1986, the glow of Little Nicky Scarfo's power had begun to flicker. What had once been a tightly wound machine of fear and obedience was starting to unravel, piece by piece, from the inside. To outsiders, Scarfo still seemed untouchable, the undisputed ruler of Philadelphia's criminal world, flush with casino money and commanding respect through violence. But beneath that facade, his empire was rotting. The very weapon that had secured his control, fear, had also poisoned his foundation. His soldiers obeyed him, yes, but they no longer trusted him. And when trust disappears in the Mafia, betrayal is never far behind. The first cracks appeared quietly, like hairline fractures in glass. Associates who had once been unwaveringly loyal began questioning Scarfo's decisions. Some whispered that he had gone too far, that his obsession with power had turned him into a liability. Others feared his growing paranoia, which now bordered on madness. Scarfo had always been suspicious, but as FBI surveillance intensified, his anxiety deepened. He saw enemies everywhere, in rival families, in his own crew, even in his own bloodline. His temper became explosive. He began ordering murders on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. A soldier who showed up late to a meeting was shot. Another, accused of looking nervous during dinner, disappeared without a trace. These killings were meant to reinforce control, but instead, they created an atmosphere of terror so intense that even his most trusted men began planning their escape. Scarfo's nephew and underboss, Philip "Crazy Phil" Leonetti, began to see the danger too. For years, Leonetti had been his uncle's shadow, fiercely loyal, efficient, and unflinchingly obedient. But now, even Leonetti couldn't ignore the signs. Scarfo's rage was turning inward, destroying the family from within. He started thinking everyone was out to get him, Leonetti would later testify. If you looked at him wrong, he'd want you dead. At the same time, the FBI's war on organized crime was entering a new era. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, had given federal prosecutors powerful tools to dismantle entire criminal networks, not just individual figures. Where once the Mafia had thrived in the shadows, technology and legal innovation were now turning those shadows into traps. Wiretaps, hidden microphones, and flipped witnesses became the Bureau's sharpest weapons. Scarfo's empire was riddled with these silent threats. Unknown to him, several of his own men were now informants, feeding details of meetings, murders, and money laundering operations to the feds. What made it worse was that many of these informants weren't driven by morality, they were driven by fear. They knew that if Scarfo suspected them of betrayal, they were as good as dead. Cooperation with the government became a twisted form of survival. Meanwhile, the profits that had once flowed freely from Atlantic City began to dry up. Increased law enforcement scrutiny, coupled with infighting and paranoia, disrupted the operations. Construction kickbacks were being monitored. Unions that had once paid willingly were now cautious or defiant. The easy money that had fueled Scarfo's rise was vanishing, replaced by debt, suspicion, and desperation. To maintain his dominance, Scarfo intensified his campaign of control. He demanded more tributes, more loyalty, more fear. He began targeting even legitimate businessmen who had once supported him. Some fled the city altogether, preferring exile to the risk of crossing the volatile boss. Scarfo ruled like a dictator, one associate later said. But even dictators need followers. He ran out of those. The real turning point came when Scarfo turned on his own allies. Among his victims were some of the most trusted members of the family, men who had stood by him during his ascent. In 1986, he ordered the execution of Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, a longtime friend and capo, over a minor disagreement. The hit shocked the entire organization. If someone as close as Merlino could be killed, no one was safe. Scarfo's paranoia had officially crossed into self-destruction. Each killing sent ripples of fear through the ranks, but it also eroded the last vestiges of loyalty. Soldiers began cooperating with law enforcement at an unprecedented rate. Some turned themselves in preemptively, offering to testify in exchange for protection. Others simply vanished, choosing to disappear rather than risk Scarfo's wrath or the FBI's pressure. Leonetti, who had always been the enforcer of his uncle's brutality, began to see that the empire was doomed. His uncle's once brilliant mind was now clouded by delusion. Scarfo would rant about invisible enemies, about plots from New York or secret betrayal within his crew. He kept loaded guns in every room of his house and slept with a pistol under his pillow. Even his closest associates were terrified to speak around him. The FBI, sensing the growing instability, tightened its grip. Agents infiltrated deeper into the organization, flipping witnesses and securing taped conversations that would soon form the backbone of massive indictments. Every month seemed to bring another defection, another leak. What had once been a fortress of silence was now filled with cracks. One of the most significant blows came in late 1986 when federal prosecutors unsealed indictments against dozens of Scarfo's associates under RICO charges. The documents detailed years of extortion, bribery, and murder, much of it corroborated by insiders. The once invincible Scarfo family was suddenly being dismantled piece by piece in the courts. The trials that followed exposed everything. For the first time, juries heard about the inner workings of Scarfo's reign, the murders ordered over minor disputes, the constant paranoia, the fear that ruled the family. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man consumed by his own darkness, a tyrant who destroyed everything he touched. The evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses, some of whom had once sat at Scarfo's dinner table, were damning. As the walls closed in, Scarfo lashed out even harder. He accused Leonetti of betrayal, screamed at his lawyers, and cursed the very men who had once sworn loyalty to him. But behind the bluster, he knew the truth. The empire he had built through blood and intimidation was collapsing. The fear he had inspired had turned against him, transforming his army of enforcers into a chorus of witnesses. By 1987, little Nicky Scarfo's reign was effectively over. Arrested, indicted, and isolated, he found himself trapped by the very paranoia that had defined his rule. The FBI had succeeded where Bruno's enemies never could. They had dismantled the Philadelphia Mafia from the inside. The family was fractured, its leadership either dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. And as Scarfo sat in his prison cell, surrounded by concrete walls instead of soldiers, the irony of his fate was impossible to ignore. Angelo Bruno had ruled through peace and was betrayed by those he trusted. Scarfo had ruled through fear, and was betrayed by those who feared him most. In the end, both men's stories converged on the same truth: in the world of organized crime, power never lasts. It consumes, it corrupts, and it devours its own creators. The gentle Don and the mad boss were two sides of the same coin, one seeking peace, the other power, both destroyed by the same shadow that haunted them, betrayal. And though Bruno's ghost had long faded from the streets of Philadelphia, his legacy lingered still, a quiet whisper in the ruins of Scarfo's empire, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of power, there once existed a time when respect ruled where fear now reigned. By the late 1980s, the mighty Philadelphia crime family that had once terrified judges, businessmen, and street soldiers alike was on its knees. The iron grip of Nicodemo, little Nicky Scarfo, once so unshakable, had loosened entirely. The empire he built through blood and fear had imploded from within. The newspapers that once whispered his name in terror now splashed it across front pages with bold headlines: Scarfo indicted in Mafia crackdown. The man who once commanded armies of killers now found himself surrounded not by loyal capos, but by FBI agents with warrants in their hands. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. On a cold January morning in 1987, Scarfo was taken into custody by federal agents in Atlantic City. The moment symbolized more than just another mobster's fall, it marked the collapse of an era. Gone was the swaggering figure who strutted through casinos and construction sites, demanding tribute. In his place was a short, aging man with slicked back hair, handcuffed and silent, his expression betraying neither fear nor regret, only the awareness that the empire of fear he had built had finally consumed itself. The indictment that followed was staggering. Federal prosecutors had assembled one of the most comprehensive RICO cases ever filed against a regional mafia family. The charges included racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and a long list of murders, including those of capos, associates, and even civilians who had simply crossed Scarfo at the wrong time. The prosecution's strategy was simple: they would prove that the entire Philadelphia mob operated as a criminal enterprise under Scarfo's direct control, and that he was personally responsible for the violence that kept it alive. What made the government's case so devastating was the testimony of insiders. For the first time, key figures within the Philadelphia organization broke the code of omerta, the mafia's sacred vow of silence. Among them was none other than Scarfo's nephew and former underboss, Philip "Crazy Phil" Leonetti. His decision to cooperate was a betrayal that stunned the underworld. Leonetti, who had been at Scarfo's side during every major decision, turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony would open the floodgates of truth: the killings, the paranoia, the extortion schemes, all laid bare for the world to see. Leonetti's words cut deep. In chilling detail, he described his uncle's brutality, his growing instability, and the toxic fear that permeated every corner of the family. You couldn't talk around him, Leonetti said in court. He thought everyone was plotting against him. If he even suspected you were disloyal, you were dead. His accounts of Scarfo's reign were not the wild exaggerations of prosecutors or journalists, they came from a man who had lived them. The courtroom became a theater of revelation. Wiretap recordings were played aloud, capturing Scarfo's raspy voice giving orders to murder, intimidate, and control. Former associates testified about hidden meetings in dimly lit restaurants, about envelopes stuffed with cash passed to politicians and contractors, about bodies buried in concrete foundations. Piece by piece, the illusion of Scarfo's invincibility crumbled. The defense tried to paint a different picture: that Scarfo was being persecuted for the sins of others, that the government's witnesses were liars and opportunists. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The FBI had spent years methodically documenting his crimes, infiltrating his organization, and flipping his closest allies. By the time the trial began, Scarfo had already lost more than half of his soldiers to prison or betrayal. The verdict, when it came, was no surprise. In 1988, after a lengthy and highly publicized trial, Nicodemo Scarfo was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and murder. The judge sentenced him to 55 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man already in his late 50s. The courtroom, once filled with reporters and spectators eager for a glimpse of the infamous mob boss, fell silent as the sentence was read. Scarfo didn't flinch. He stared ahead, his face expressionless, as if already resigned to the fate he had spent years trying to outrun. Behind bars, Scarfo continued to live as though he were still the boss. He demanded respect from other inmates, issued threats through intermediaries, and even tried to maintain control over what was left of the Philadelphia family. But his power was gone. The organization he had once ruled with absolute authority had fractured beyond repair. Rival factions emerged, led by younger men who saw Scarfo's downfall as a chance to rebuild, or to settle old scores. The government's campaign against the Mafia was also changing the landscape. The success of the Scarfo prosecution became a model for future cases across the country. Federal agents who had spent decades chasing shadows were now dismantling entire families through RICO prosecutions and witness cooperation. The old ways, loyalty, secrecy, fear, no longer offered protection. The age of the untouchable dawn was over. For Philadelphia, the fall of Little Nicky marked the end of a dark chapter. The streets that had once echoed with gunfire now fell quiet, though the scars remained. Neighborhoods once dominated by mob influence began to change. Construction projects that had been breeding grounds for corruption were now regulated, monitored, and sanitized. The aura of mystery that had surrounded the mob was fading, replaced by the mundane bureaucracy of law enforcement. And yet, for all his cruelty, Scarfo's story fascinated the public. Journalists, authors, and filmmakers were drawn to his contradictions: the small man with the oversized ego, the tyrant who ruled through terror, the heir to Bruno's peaceful legacy who instead drenched it in blood. His rise and fall read like a Shakespearean tragedy: ambition, paranoia, betrayal, and an inevitable reckoning. In prison, Scarfo refused to show remorse. He insisted that he had been betrayed, not defeated. To him, Leonetti's cooperation was the ultimate act of treachery, the betrayal of blood. He told anyone who would listen that he had been framed by jealous rivals and corrupt officials. But deep down, even he must have sensed the truth: the empire hadn't been destroyed from the outside, it had collapsed from within. When the sentence was finalized, and Scarfo was transferred to a maximum security federal prison, it was as though a storm had finally passed over Philadelphia. The mob was shattered, its hierarchy decimated, its leaders imprisoned. For the first time in decades, there was no clear boss. The city that had once trembled under Mafia rule now moved on, its people eager to forget the days when a man like Little Nicky could decide who lived or died with a single word. Scarfo would spend the rest of his life behind bars, clinging to the illusion of power, replaying old triumphs in his mind. But the world outside had changed. The Mafia's code had been broken. Its secrets had been exposed. And the legend of Nicodemo Scarfo, the ruthless, paranoid tyrant who brought down his own empire, became a cautionary tale, a dark echo of what happens when fear becomes a man's only legacy. The Philadelphia mob, once united under the calm, calculating leadership of Angelo Bruno, was now nothing more than fragments of memory and ruin. And somewhere, in the cold silence of his cell, Scarfo must have wondered, if only for a fleeting moment, whether Bruno's way had been the wiser path after all. The path of peace. The path he had scorned. The path that might have saved them all. March 21, 1980, a calm spring night in South Philadelphia. Angelo Bruno, 70 years old, settled into the front passenger seat of his car outside his home after returning from dinner with his trusted consigliere, Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponegro. The street was quiet, the hum of the city distant. Then, in a flash of betrayal, a single shotgun blast shattered the silence. The gentle Don, who had ruled through peace, was killed instantly. The irony was cruel. Bruno, who had spent a lifetime avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, died by the very violence he had tried to suppress. His assassin sat behind him, a man he had trusted, a man who believed the commission would bless a change in leadership. But there had been no approval, no blessing. Only greed and impatience masquerading as ambition. When neighbors found his body, his hat still rested neatly on his head, his expression calm, almost peaceful, as if unaware that betrayal had come for him. News of his death spread through Philadelphia like wildfire. For decades, he had kept the streets quiet, the families stable, and business steady. Now, with one pull of a trigger, the city's fragile order shattered. The commission, furious at the unsanctioned hit, moved swiftly. Within weeks, Caponegro and his brother-in-law were tortured and killed in New York, a grim message that even among criminals, rules must be honored. Bruno's funeral drew hundreds, gangsters, politicians, and neighbors alike, all united in uneasy mourning. As his coffin was lowered, one thought echoed in every mind: the gentle Don was gone, and with him, the last trace of peace in Philadelphia's underworld. The night Angelo Bruno died, the balance he had spent decades maintaining collapsed almost instantly. His body slumped in the passenger seat of his car, a single bullet through the back of his head, a quiet end. For a man who had lived by calmness. But his death was anything but peaceful for those he left behind. Within weeks, Philadelphia erupted into chaos. The streets once ruled by order became battlefields of betrayal and revenge. Antonio, Tony Bananas, Caponegro, Bruno's consigliere and the man behind the assassination, believed he would rise to power. Instead, the Mafia commission condemned his act as treason. In a twist of brutal irony, Caponegro and his brother-in-law were found stuffed in car trunks in New York, tortured and executed, punishment for killing a boss without permission. The power vacuum drew vultures. Nicky Scarfo, once an overlooked figure, rose through violence, transforming Bruno's peaceful empire into one soaked in blood. Where Bruno had ruled with patience, Scarfo ruled with paranoia. Dozens of murders followed, allies turned on allies, soldiers vanished, and South Philadelphia, once calm, descended into terror. Law enforcement moved in swiftly. The FBI, once frustrated by Bruno's quiet operations, now found the chaos easy to exploit. Wiretaps, arrests, and informants tore the family apart. By the late 1980s, what remained of the Philadelphia Mafia was only a shell, a ghost of the stable empire Bruno had built. In death, the gentle Don had proven one final truth: peace in the underworld existed only as long as restraint did. And with his voice silenced, that fragile peace was gone forever. After Angelo Bruno's death, his name became a quiet echo through the corridors of Mafia history, a reminder of what order once looked like in a violent world. He was remembered not for his crimes, but for his restraint. Men who had lived under his rule spoke of him with an odd respect, recalling how he kept peace in Philadelphia when other cities drowned in blood. He was fair, one said softly, and that was rare. Bruno's philosophy, calmness, diplomacy, invisibility, became a lost art in the decades that followed. When Nicky Scarfo turned the city into a war zone, even his enemies whispered that Bruno had been right. The FBI called him the last rational Don, a man who understood that fear burns quickly, but respect endures. He avoided drugs, refused unnecessary killings, and believed that patience was more powerful than violence. Across the country, mob bosses remembered his methods. His death became a cautionary tale: kill a boss without permission, and chaos follows. The commission itself changed its rules because of him. In classrooms, books, and documentaries, he became a study in control, a man who ruled an empire through silence. Even as the Mafia faded into memory, Bruno's calm voice seemed to linger, teaching one final lesson, that true power lies not in force, but in restraint. His ghost, they say, still walks the streets of South Philadelphia, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the order he once kept, and the peace that died with him. Angelo Bruno's story ends not in noise, but in stillness. His murder in 1980 closed the book on an age of balance within the Mafia. The car where he died became a symbol, of betrayal, of silence, of the end of respect among thieves. Yet, in death, his legend only deepened. To many, he became a ghostly figure of reason in a world that had lost its logic. South Philadelphia changed, but his name lingered like a memory carried on the wind. Old men still told stories of the gentle Don, who never raised his voice, who believed in words over bullets. Lawmen, too, spoke of him with rare admiration, the last of the gentlemen, they said. He had understood that power was not about fear, but control. Time softened his story, turning him from a criminal into a symbol of calm leadership. His life became a quiet parable, that peace, even among the ruthless, was possible, but never permanent. In the hum of the city at night, his legend still drifts, gentle and unbroken, whispering a truth that outlived him: real power doesn't shout. It whispers, and then it disappears.